In the heart of a bustling city where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and streets buzzed with life, Detective Mark Reynolds was known for his bold, no-nonsense attitude. He wasn't just another officer in uniform. He was someone who believed rules were meant to be bent, if not broken altogether. To some, Reynolds was a hero, the kind of cop who got results even if it meant stepping over ethical lines. To others, he was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. His reputation as a loose cannon had grown over the years, but nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened on that fateful evening. It all began on an ordinary night. The air was thick with humidity, and the streets were alive with people, rushing home after long days at work. Detective Reynolds, wearing his usual scowl and driving his unmarked police car, patrolled the downtown area. His shift had been uneventful so far, just routine stops and minor disturbances, but deep down he craved action. Little did he know, his craving was about to lead him into a situation that would change his life forever. As Reynolds drove through the dimly lit streets, his eyes caught sight of a sleek black sedan speeding past him. It wasn't just any car. It was moving well above the speed limit, weaving dangerously between other vehicles. Reynolds' instincts kicked in immediately. "Gotcha," he muttered under his breath, flipping on the flashing lights atop his vehicle. The chase was short-lived. Within minutes, the sedan pulled over onto the side of the road, its engine still purring softly. Reynolds stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt and holster as he approached the driver's side window. What he didn't expect was who sat behind the wheel. There, looking calm but slightly annoyed, was none other than Jonathan Hayes, the U.S. Attorney General himself. Hayes, dressed casually in jeans and a blazer, looked like any other citizen enjoying a quiet evening. But Reynolds recognized him instantly. "License and registration, please," Reynolds barked, his tone sharp and authoritative. Hayes complied, without hesitation, handing over the requested documents. As Reynolds glanced at them, his expression darkened. He'd already formed an opinion about this man based on preconceived notions. Rich, powerful, untouchable. The kind of person Reynolds despised most. "You're aware you were speeding, right?" Reynolds asked, sneering slightly. Hayes nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, officer. I apologize. I lost track of my speed leaving a meeting earlier." But Reynolds wasn't satisfied. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, something about Hayes irked him. Maybe it was the way Hayes spoke, calm, measured, almost condescending. Or maybe it was the fact that this high-ranking official seemed oblivious to the struggles of everyday people. Whatever it was, Reynolds decided to push harder. "You think your fancy title makes you special? You think you can break the law because you wear a suit and tie?" Reynolds snapped, leaning closer to the open window. Passers-by began to notice the commotion, pausing to watch the exchange unfold. Some pulled out their phones, capturing snippets of the confrontation. Hayes remained composed, though his patience was clearly wearing thin. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I assure you I'm fully cooperative. Let's resolve this appropriately." His words carried authority, yet they only fueled Reynolds's anger. "Appropriately? You want to talk about appropriate? How about we start with how guys like you sit in your ivory towers while the rest of us deal with the mess you leave behind?" Reynolds spat, his voice rising. By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves as they recorded the scene. Things escalated quickly. Reynolds, unable to contain his rage, made a shocking decision. With one swift motion, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Hayes. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and several people shouted in alarm. Hayes froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. "What's the matter, Mr. Bigshot? Not so tough now, are you?" Reynolds growled, his finger hovering near the trigger. The tension was palpable, and the atmosphere crackled with fear and uncertainty. Hayes said nothing, choosing instead to maintain eye contact with Reynolds, his expression unreadable. The standoff lasted mere seconds, though it felt like hours. Finally, realizing he'd gone too far, Reynolds lowered his weapon, though not before delivering one final insult. "Get out of here before I change my mind," he snarled, stepping back and gesturing toward the road. Hayes didn't hesitate. He started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and disappeared into the night. Unbeknownst to Reynolds, the damage was done. The videos taken by witnesses spread across social media platforms within minutes, sparking outrage nationwide. People debated the incident passionately, questioning how such a blatant abuse of power could occur. Calls for justice echoed loudly, putting immense pressure on authorities to take action against Reynolds. For Hayes, the ordeal was far from over. Though physically unharmed, he couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability he'd experienced during those tense moments. Yet instead of retreating into silence, he resolved to address the issue head-on. This wasn't just about him. It was about accountability, fairness, and ensuring that no one, regardless of position or badge, was above the law. And so, as the sun rose over the city the following morning, the stage was set for a dramatic showdown between two men whose lives had collided in ways neither could have anticipated. For Reynolds, the consequences of his actions would soon catch up with him in ways he never imagined. And for Hayes, the challenge ahead was clear: to turn this personal attack into an opportunity to advocate for meaningful change. The video of Detective Mark Reynolds pointing a gun at U.S. Attorney General Jonathan Hayes went viral almost overnight. Social media platforms were flooded with clips of the incident, each one accompanied by captions and hashtags that fueled public outrage. People from all walks of life weighed in on the matter, turning it into a national conversation about power, accountability, and justice. The footage captured every detail of the confrontation: the aggressive tone in Reynolds' voice, the shock on Hayes' face, and the horrified reactions of bystanders. It was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. As the days passed, the story dominated news headlines across the country. Television anchors dissected every angle of the incident during primetime broadcasts, while talk show hosts debated whether Reynolds' actions constituted criminal behavior or simply an overzealous display of authority. Online forums buzzed with heated discussions, with some users defending Reynolds as a misunderstood officer pushed to his limits, while others condemned him as a reckless bully who had abused his position. The divide grew wider with each passing hour, highlighting the deep-rooted tensions between law enforcement and the communities they served. Civil rights organizations wasted no time in issuing statements condemning Reynolds' conduct. Leaders, from groups like the ACLU and NAACP, described the incident as a textbook example of police brutality and called for immediate action against the detective. "This is not just about one man's mistake," said a prominent activist during a televised interview. "It's about a systemic issue where officers feel emboldened to act outside the law without fear of consequences." Their words resonated with millions, sparking protests in major cities and drawing attention to broader issues of inequality and abuse of power within policing. Meanwhile, pro-police factions attempted to defend Reynolds, though their arguments often fell flat under scrutiny. Some claimed that Hayes must have provoked the officer in some way, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Others argued that the stress of being a police officer justified moments of poor judgment. These defenses, however, only served to deepen public distrust. Many saw them as excuses rather than explanations, further polarizing the debate. Even among fellow officers, opinions were divided. While a few stood by Reynolds, citing the pressures of the job, many more distanced themselves from him, fearing guilt by association. For Jonathan Hayes, the aftermath of the incident was both exhausting and enlightening. As a public figure, he understood the weight of his role and knew he couldn't remain silent. 2 days after the altercation, he held a press conference at the Department of Justice headquarters. Flanked by colleagues and legal advisors, Hayes addressed the nation with grace and composure. Standing behind a podium adorned with the seal of the United States, he spoke directly to the American people. "This moment is not about me," Hayes began, his voice firm yet measured. "It's about something much bigger than any one individual. What happened 2 nights ago was unacceptable, not because it involved me, but because it represents everything we must work to change. No one should live in fear of those sworn to protect us. No badge, no title, and no uniform grants anyone the right to intimidate, threaten, or harm another person." His speech struck a chord with listeners. For many, Hayes's words transcended, the specifics of the case becoming a rallying cry for reform. He emphasized the importance of holding law enforcement accountable while also acknowledging the challenges faced by officers daily. We need to build trust between our communities and the men and women who serve them, he continued. That starts with transparency, fairness, and mutual respect. But behind the scenes, Hayes faced mounting pressure. Political insiders whispered about how this incident might impact his career. Some speculated that his push for criminal justice reform, a cornerstone of his tenure as Attorney General, could be derailed by critics eager to discredit him. Others wondered if the emotional toll of the event would weaken his resolve. Despite these concerns, Hayes remained steadfast. If anything, the ordeal seemed to strengthen his determination to create lasting change. Reynolds, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated. Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation into his conduct, digging into years of complaints filed against him by citizens. Anonymous tips poured in from individuals claiming harassment, false arrests, and excessive force at Reynolds's hands. Former colleagues, once quick to praise his results-oriented approach, now distanced themselves, unwilling to risk association with someone so deeply embroiled in controversy. Publicly, Reynolds tried to salvage his reputation. In interviews with sympathetic media outlets, he painted himself as a victim of circumstance, blaming the system for turning against him. "I'm not perfect, but I've always done my best to keep this city safe," he declared during one particularly fiery segment. "Now, because of one bad night, everyone wants to crucify me. Where's the fairness in that?" His defiant attitude, however, only made matters worse. Critics dismissed his comments as self-serving, and supporters dwindled further. The strain of the scandal began taking a toll on Reynolds's personal life as well. His marriage, already strained by long hours and constant stress, crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. His wife, unable to cope with the backlash or her husband's growing bitterness, filed for divorce. Friends stopped calling, and neighbors avoided him when he ventured outside. Stripped of his badge pending trial, Reynolds retreated into solitude, spending his days drinking alone and replaying the events of that fateful night in his mind. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Reynolds refused to admit fault. Instead, he doubled down on his narrative, accusing Hayes of orchestrating a smear campaign to silence critics of the Department of Justice. "This isn't about accountability," he told anyone who would listen. "It's about politics. They're using me as a scapegoat to push their agenda." But the more he spoke, the less credible he became. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Reynolds was guilty, not just of threatening Hayes, but of embodying everything wrong with modern policing. Amidst the turmoil, calls for justice grew louder. Protesters gathered outside, police headquarters demanding swift action against Reynolds. Petitions circulated online, urging lawmakers to implement stricter oversight measures for law enforcement. Celebrities and influencers joined the movement, amplifying the message through their massive followings. Every corner of society seemed to be speaking out, united by a shared desire for change. Yet, amid the noise and fury, one question lingered. What would happen next? Would Reynolds face criminal charges, or would he escape punishment altogether? Could Hayes's call for reform gain enough momentum to bring about meaningful progress? And perhaps most importantly, what lessons could be learned from this shocking collision of power and vulnerability? As the nation waited for answers, the ripple effects of that single night continued to spread. Lives had been altered, reputations tarnished, and systems scrutinized. For better or worse, the confrontation between Detective Mark Reynolds and U.S. Attorney General Jonathan Hayes had ignited a firestorm, one that showed no signs of burning out anytime soon. Detective Mark Reynolds' life spiraled out of control faster than anyone could have predicted. Once a figure of authority and fear on the streets, he now found himself at the center of a storm that was tearing apart everything he had built over the years. The Internal Affairs investigation into his conduct revealed a pattern of behavior that shocked even seasoned investigators. Complaints about harassment, excessive force, and unethical practices piled up like bricks in a wall that seemed impossible to climb. Anonymous tips poured in from people who claimed they had been too afraid to speak up before, but now saw an opportunity to expose the truth. Reynolds tried to fight back, but his efforts only dug him deeper into trouble. In interviews with sympathetic journalists, he painted himself as a misunderstood hero, a cop who got results because he wasn't afraid to break rules. "You think criminals follow the law? They don't," he argued passionately during one televised appearance. "If I want to catch them, sometimes I have to play their game." But the public wasn't buying it anymore. His words came across as excuses rather than explanations, and each interview seemed to tarnish his reputation further. Behind closed doors, Reynolds faced mounting isolation. Fellow officers who once admired his tough guy persona began avoiding him altogether. Some whispered behind his back, calling him reckless and dangerous. Others outright condemned him, saying he had brought shame upon the entire department. Even those who might have sympathized with his plight kept their distance, fearing guilt by association. Without allies or support, Reynolds felt abandoned by the very system he had sworn to serve. His personal life unraveled just as quickly. His wife, already struggling with the pressures of being married to a high-profile cop, reached her breaking point. The constant media attention, the late-night arguments, and the overwhelming sense of embarrassment finally became too much for her to bear. One evening, after yet another heated exchange, she packed her bags and left, filing for divorce shortly thereafter. For Reynolds, this loss hit harder than anything else. His marriage had been his anchor, the one thing grounding him amidst the chaos of his career. Without it, he felt adrift, unsure of who he was or what he stood for. Stripped of his badge and suspended without pay pending trial, Reynolds retreated into solitude. He spent hours alone in his apartment, drinking heavily and replaying the events of that fateful night over and over in his mind. At first, he convinced himself that he had done nothing wrong, that Hayes deserved what he got for acting so smug and untouchable. But as days turned into weeks, cracks began to form in his armor of denial. Late at night, when the alcohol wore off and the silence grew deafening, doubts crept in. Had he gone too far? Was he really the villain everyone made him out to be? Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against him moved forward with relentless momentum. Prosecutors presented damning evidence, dashcam footage from his patrol car, witness testimonies, and documented complaints spanning years. Each piece of the puzzle painted a picture of a man who believed himself above the law, a man who thought his badge gave him immunity from consequences. Faced with overwhelming proof of misconduct, Reynolds's defense team struggled to mount a convincing case. Their attempts to shift blame onto Hayes fell flat, especially after Hayes himself addressed the court with quiet dignity, urging accountability, without vengeance. As the trial approached, Reynolds's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He stopped answering calls from friends, ignored messages from family members, and rarely left his apartment. His once imposing frame grew gaunt from lack of sleep and poor nutrition. Dark circles formed under his eyes and his usual swagger disappeared entirely. Neighbors whispered about the haunted look on his face whenever he ventured outside to grab groceries or mail. It was as if the weight of his actions and the impending judgment had crushed the spirit out of him. Then came the night that sealed his fate. Desperate for a distraction, Reynolds decided to take a walk through the city streets he used to patrol. It was late, and the air carried a chill that matched his mood. Passing by a convenience store, he impulsively stepped inside, hoping a cup of coffee might help clear his mind. But fate had other plans. As he browsed the aisles, masked gunmen stormed into the store, shouting orders and waving weapons. Panic erupted as customers scrambled for cover, knocking over shelves and tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Reynolds froze, rooted to the spot. For someone who had always prided himself on being fearless, the sight of armed robbers sent waves of terror coursing through his body. Before he could react, one of the gunmen spotted him and barked, "Get down." Reynolds obeyed immediately, dropping to the floor behind a counter. His heart pounded wildly as he listened to the chaos unfolding around him. The sound of cash registers opening, the muffled cries of hostages, and the cold click of gun triggers being pulled. What happened next was surreal. One of the robbers recognized Reynolds from news reports and social media posts. Laughing cruelly, the gunman taunted him, mocking his downfall and threatening retribution for all the lives he'd allegedly ruined. "Look at you now, big shot cop," the robber sneered. "Not so tough without your badge, huh?" Reynolds said nothing, his pride swallowed whole by sheer terror. All he could do was cower and pray for rescue. Hours passed before SWAT teams arrived, breaching the store and neutralizing the threat. Hostages were freed, shaken but alive, and the robbers were apprehended. As paramedics tended to the victims, cameras captured footage of Reynolds emerging from his hiding place, trembling and pale. The images spread online within minutes, drawing sharp contrasts between the arrogant detective who had humiliated Hayes and the broken man, now begging for mercy. Social media erupted with comments ranging from pity to schadenfreude, but the message was clear. Karma had struck back in full force. In the aftermath of the hostage ordeal, Reynolds returned home, physically unharmed but emotionally shattered. The incident forced him to confront the reality of his situation. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how fragile power truly was, and how quickly it could slip away. The bravado that had defined him for years crumbled under the weight of humility. He began attending counseling sessions not because he wanted to, but because he needed to make sense of the mess he had created. Slowly, painfully, Reynolds started piecing together the fragments of his life. He took odd jobs to make ends meet, working shifts at gas stations and warehouses. Though the work was menial compared to his former career, it gave him a sense of purpose. More importantly, it allowed him to interact with ordinary people whose struggles he had once dismissed but now understood intimately. He also began participating in restorative justice programs, speaking candidly about his mistakes and the lessons he had learned. At first, these appearances were met with skepticism and hostility, but over time some listeners softened. They saw in Reynolds not just a fallen officer, but a flawed human being trying to find redemption. While forgiveness didn't come easily, or universally, it offered a glimmer of hope that change was possible even for someone like him. For Reynolds, the journey was far from over. Every day brought new challenges, new reminders of the damage he had caused. Yet amidst the wreckage of his past, he discovered something unexpected: resilience. Whether it stemmed from desperation or genuine remorse, he couldn't say. What mattered most was that he was trying, and for the first time in a long while that felt like enough. The hostage ordeal at the convenience store was a turning point for Detective Mark Reynolds, though not in the way anyone might have expected. It wasn't just the humiliation of being recognized by the robbers, or the stark contrast between his former bravado and his current state of helplessness. It was the raw, unfiltered realization that life had come full circle. For years, Reynolds had wielded power recklessly, believing himself untouchable because of his badge. Now, stripped of that authority, he found himself on the receiving end of fear and intimidation. The experience left him shaken to his core, forcing him to confront truths he had long ignored. When SWAT teams finally breached the store and subdued the robbers, Reynolds emerged from behind the counter looking like a shadow of his former self. His hands trembled as he stood up, his legs wobbling beneath him. Cameras captured every moment, the wide-eyed terror in his expression, the sweat dripping down his face, the way his body seemed to shrink under the weight of what he'd endured. Those images spread across social media within minutes, reigniting conversations about karma and accountability. Comment sections lit up with reactions ranging from pity to mockery, but one sentiment remained consistent: this was justice served cold. In the days following the incident, Reynolds became a recluse. He avoided leaving his apartment, too ashamed to face the world. News outlets played clips of the hostage situation repeatedly, each broadcast serving as a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. Friends and acquaintances who might have reached out initially stopped trying altogether. Even his ex-wife, who had once promised to support him through anything, distanced herself further after seeing the footage. Reynolds felt abandoned by everyone, including himself. The man who had once strutted confidently through city streets now struggled to look at his own reflection in the mirror. But something shifted inside him during those lonely weeks. For the first time in years, Reynolds allowed himself to sit quietly with his thoughts instead of drowning them out with anger or alcohol. He replayed the events of the hostage ordeal over and over, not to relive the fear, but to understand why it had happened. Was this truly karma, as so many people claimed? Or was it simply the natural consequence of years spent abusing power without regard for others? Either way, the lesson was clear. Actions have consequences, and no one, not even someone like him, is immune. Reynolds decided to take responsibility for his past behavior, starting with small steps. He began attending mandatory counseling sessions ordered by the court, though initially he approached them with reluctance. At first, he sat silently in the therapist's office, arms crossed, refusing to engage. But over time, he opened up, sharing fragments of his story and acknowledging the harm he had caused. The process was excruciating, peeling back layers of denial and confronting painful truths, but it also brought moments of clarity. For the first time, Reynolds saw himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone capable of change. As word of his participation in therapy spread, some members of the community invited him to speak at restorative justice workshops. These programs aimed to bridge gaps between law enforcement and civilians by fostering dialogue and understanding. Reynolds hesitated at first, unsure if anyone would listen to him after everything that had happened. But eventually he agreed, driven by a desire to make amends, even if only in a small way. At his first workshop, Reynolds walked onto the stage to a room filled with skeptical faces. Some attendees whispered among themselves, while others glared, openly. Taking a deep breath, he began speaking haltingly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said, pausing to steady himself. "I know I don't deserve it. What I did was wrong, plain and simple. And I can't undo the damage I've caused." He went on to describe his journey from arrogance to humility, admitting publicly that he had been blinded by ego and misplaced pride. To his surprise, the audience didn't immediately dismiss him. While some remained critical, others listened, intently, nodding along as he spoke. A few even approached him afterward, thanking him for his honesty. One woman, whose son had been falsely arrested by Reynolds years earlier, told him she appreciated his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes. "It doesn't erase what happened," she said firmly, "but it's a start." Encouraged by this response, Reynolds continued participating in similar events, gradually finding purpose in helping others learn from his failures. He mentored at-risk youth, sharing stories about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of treating people with respect. During these sessions, he often reflected on his own upbringing, a childhood marked by neglect and hardship that had shaped his worldview. By confronting his past, he hoped to break the cycle of pain and prevent others from making the same mistakes he had. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hayes kept a close watch on developments surrounding Reynolds' case. Though he rarely commented publicly on the matter, he followed news reports and updates closely, intrigued by the transformation taking place. Hayes had always believed in second chances, provided they came with genuine effort and accountability. Seeing Reynolds work toward redemption reinforced his belief that change was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. As the legal proceedings against Reynolds drew to a close, prosecutors faced a dilemma. On one hand, Reynolds' actions during the traffic stop warranted severe punishment. On the other, his recent efforts to reform suggested he was genuinely remorseful. Hayes, ever the advocate for balance, decided to intervene. In a surprising move, he submitted a statement to the court urging leniency, not because he forgave Reynolds, but because he believed rehabilitation should take precedence over retribution. "True justice isn't about revenge," Hayes wrote in his letter. "It's about creating opportunities for growth, for both individuals and society as a whole." While Detective Reynolds' actions were unacceptable, his willingness to confront his flaws and seek redemption demonstrates potential for positive change. Let us focus on building a future where accountability leads to improvement rather than despair. When the judge delivered the sentence, it reflected Hayes's sentiments. Reynolds received 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and mandatory participation in ongoing counseling and restorative justice programs. Though some critics argued the punishment was too lenient, others praised the decision as a step toward meaningful reform. For Reynolds, the verdict was bittersweet. It offered him a chance to rebuild his life, but it also reminded him daily of the trust he had broken and the work still ahead. The months that followed were challenging, yet transformative. Reynolds threw himself into his community service assignments, volunteering at shelters and youth centers. He worked tirelessly, not to earn praise, but to prove, to himself more than anyone else, that he could contribute positively. Along the way, he formed connections with people he might have dismissed in the past, learning their stories and gaining perspective on lives vastly different from his own. Through it all, Reynolds carried a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't erase his past, nor did he expect forgiveness from those he had hurt. But he understood now that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about using them as stepping stones toward becoming a better person. Every act of kindness, every apology extended, every lesson taught became part of his journey toward healing, not just for himself, but for the community he had once alienated. For Reynolds, the road ahead remained uncertain. There would undoubtedly be setbacks, moments when doubt crept in or old habits threatened to resurface. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful that he could rise above his past, hopeful that he could inspire others to do the same, and hopeful that, despite everything, there was still room for grace in a world quick to judge. Years passed since the fateful night when Detective Mark Reynolds' life unraveled, and the city slowly began to move on. The viral videos of his confrontation with U.S. Attorney General Jonathan Hayes faded from trending topics, replaced by newer scandals and headlines. But for those directly involved, the ripple effects of that incident continued to shape their lives in profound ways. For Hayes, it solidified his resolve to push for meaningful reform within law enforcement, while for Reynolds, it marked the beginning of a long and arduous journey toward redemption. Jonathan Hayes emerged from the ordeal stronger and more determined than ever. The public support he received during the controversy fueled his passion for justice, giving him a platform to advocate for systemic change. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, universities, and community forums about the need for transparency, accountability, and mutual respect between law enforcement and the communities they served. His speeches were not just calls for reform, but also reminders of the humanity behind every badge and every citizen. Hayes didn't shy away from sharing his personal experience with Reynolds. Instead, he used it as an example of how unchecked power could lead to abuse, and how even those who commit grave mistakes can find paths to redemption. "We must hold people accountable," he would say, his voice steady yet impassioned. "But we must also give them opportunities to grow. Justice is not about punishment alone, it's about transformation." His words resonated deeply, especially among younger generations eager to see tangible progress in policing practices. Behind the scenes, Hayes worked tirelessly to implement policy changes at both federal and local levels. He collaborated with lawmakers, civil rights organizations, and police unions to draft legislation aimed at increasing oversight and improving training programs for officers. One of his key initiatives focused on mental health resources for law enforcement personnel, recognizing that many officers struggled silently under the immense pressures of the job. Another initiative introduced stricter guidelines for use of force incidents, ensuring that misconduct was addressed swiftly and fairly. While these efforts faced resistance from entrenched interests, Hayes remained undeterred. Critics accused him of being too soft on crime or overly idealistic, but he countered their arguments with data and real-world examples. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he often reminded skeptics. "But if we don't start somewhere, nothing will improve." Slowly but surely, his persistence paid off. Cities began adopting his proposed reforms, and departments reported improvements in community relations. Though progress was incremental, it was undeniable. For Reynolds, life after the scandal was a mix of struggle and quiet triumphs. The sentence, handed down by the court, 5 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and extensive community service, was challenging but ultimately transformative. Each day presented new hurdles, whether it was facing harsh judgment from strangers or battling lingering feelings of shame and regret. Yet Reynolds approached his obligations with a level of dedication that surprised even himself. His community service assignments became some of the most impactful experiences of his life. Whether he was mentoring troubled teens at a youth center or serving meals at a homeless shelter, Reynolds discovered a side of humanity he had rarely considered before. He listened intently to the stories of those he met, the single mother working 2 jobs to feed her kids, the teenager grappling with anger issues because of an abusive home, the elderly man struggling to make ends meet after losing his pension. These encounters forced him to confront his own biases and assumptions, reshaping the way he viewed the world. Reynolds' participation in restorative justice workshops also proved invaluable. At first, he dreaded speaking publicly about his past actions, fearing backlash or ridicule. However, as he shared his story honestly and vulnerably, he noticed something remarkable. People responded with empathy rather than hostility. Many attendees admitted they had initially dismissed him as irredeemable, only to realize that everyone has the capacity for change. This realization gave Reynolds a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just making amends for his mistakes, he was helping others understand the importance of accountability and growth. Despite these strides, Reynolds's journey was far from easy. There were moments when old habits threatened to resurface, particularly when dealing with authority figures or navigating stressful situations. Counseling sessions helped him unpack these triggers, teaching him healthier coping mechanisms and reinforcing the importance of self-awareness. Over time, he learned to channel his frustrations constructively, focusing on building bridges rather than walls. One pivotal moment came during a neighborhood meeting organized by a local advocacy group. Reynolds attended reluctantly, unsure of what to expect. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up nervously, clutching a crumpled piece of paper filled with notes. "I know I don't deserve your trust," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "And I'm not here to ask for it. But I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, to do better. If there's anything I've learned these past few years, it's that no one should live in fear of those meant to protect them. That includes me." The room fell silent as he spoke, his sincerity cutting through years of mistrust. Afterward, several attendees approached him, thanking him for his honesty. One woman, whose brother had been wrongfully detained by Reynolds years earlier, shook his hand tearfully. "I never thought I'd hear you say sorry," she admitted. "But hearing, it means something." It was a small victory, but for Reynolds it felt monumental, a sign that healing was possible even after so much damage. As the years went by, Reynolds' reputation began to shift. Though he would always carry the weight of his past actions, he earned a measure of respect from those who witnessed his transformation. Some former colleagues reached out cautiously, expressing admiration for his resilience. Others invited him to join grassroots efforts aimed at bridging divides between law enforcement and marginalized communities. While Reynolds knew he could never fully erase the scars he had left behind, he took solace in knowing he was contributing to a brighter future. Meanwhile, Hayes's legacy as a reformer grew stronger with each passing year. His initiatives inspired similar movements nationwide, sparking conversations about fairness, equity, and compassion in policing. Though challenges remained, the groundwork he laid ensured that future generations would inherit a system less flawed than the one he inherited. For Hayes, this was enough, a testament to the power of perseverance and hope. In the end, both men found themselves forever changed by the events that brought them together. For Hayes, the incident reinforced his belief in the possibility of progress, no matter how daunting the obstacles. For Reynolds, it was a lesson in humility, accountability, and the enduring potential for redemption. Their stories, intertwined by fate, served as powerful reminders that even in the darkest moments there is always room for light, if we're willing to seek it. The story of Detective Mark Reynolds and U.S. Attorney General Jonathan Hayes became one of the most talked-about chapters in modern American history, a tale of hubris, accountability, and redemption that resonated far beyond the individuals involved. As time passed, the lessons drawn from their experiences continued to shape conversations about justice, power, and humanity. For both men, the journey had been long and arduous, filled with moments of triumph and heartbreak, but it ultimately left an indelible mark on society. For Jonathan Hayes, the incident served as a catalyst for lasting change. His advocacy for criminal justice reform gained unprecedented momentum, inspiring countless others to join the fight for fairness and transparency within law enforcement. Cities across the nation adopted policies modeled after his initiatives, introducing stricter oversight measures, improved training programs, and greater emphasis on mental health support for officers. The ripple effects were undeniable. Departments reported fewer incidents of misconduct and public trust began to rebuild, slowly but steadily. Hayes's speeches grew more impactful over time, drawing larger crowds eager to hear his message of hope and progress. He often recounted the night he faced Reynolds, not to dwell on the humiliation or fear he felt, but to highlight the importance of accountability. "That moment wasn't just about me," he would say, his voice calm yet resolute. "It was about all of us, about what happens when power is misused and how we respond to it. It's easy to point fingers, but true leadership lies in finding solutions." His words struck a chord with people from all walks of life. Young activists saw him as a beacon of integrity, while seasoned policymakers admired his pragmatism. Even critics who once dismissed him as overly idealistic softened their stance, acknowledging the tangible results of his efforts. Though challenges remained, resistance from entrenched systems, political gridlock, and occasional setbacks, Hayes refused to give up. "Progress isn't linear," he reminded everyone, "but every step forward counts." Meanwhile, Reynolds's transformation became a testament to the possibility of redemption, even for those who seemed beyond saving. Once reviled as a symbol of unchecked authority, he reinvented himself through sheer determination and humility. His work mentoring at-risk youth earned him unexpected allies, including teachers, counselors, and parents who recognized the value of second chances. Many of the teenagers he worked with credited him with helping them turn their lives around, citing his honesty and vulnerability as key factors in their success. Reynolds also found solace in small victories, moments when someone forgave him, however reluctantly, or acknowledged the effort he put into changing. A former victim of one of his wrongful arrests shook his hand at a community event, saying simply, "I see you're trying. That matters." Such gestures meant more to him than any accolade ever could. They reminded him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past but proving that people can grow. Yet despite these successes, Reynolds carried scars that would never fully heal. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he had caused, nor did he expect forgiveness from everyone. But he accepted this reality with quiet resolve, focusing instead on contributing positively wherever he could. Whether it was volunteering at shelters, speaking at restorative justice workshops, or simply listening to someone share their struggles, he poured his energy into making amends, not because he sought approval, but because it gave his life meaning. As the years went by, the two men occasionally crossed paths again, at conferences, award ceremonies, or community gatherings. Their interactions were always cordial, though tinged with an unspoken understanding of the weight they both carried. Hayes never let Reynolds off the hook entirely, reminding him gently during one encounter, "You've come a long way, but don't stop now. Keep going." Reynolds nodded solemnly, grateful for the acknowledgement and the challenge. Their intertwined stories became part of the cultural fabric, retold in books, documentaries, and even school curriculums. Teachers used their saga to teach students about accountability, resilience, and the complexities of human nature. Journalists revisited the case periodically, reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful night. Social media users shared memes and quotes inspired by their journeys, turning phrases like "instant karma" and "redemption takes courage" into rallying cries for justice and personal growth. But perhaps the most profound impact lay in the everyday lives touched by their actions. Families affected by police misconduct found strength in knowing someone held officers accountable. Officers struggling with ethical dilemmas looked to Reynolds' story as proof that admitting fault didn't mean failure, it meant growth. And ordinary citizens, witnessing the evolution of both men, felt empowered to demand better from their leaders while extending grace to those willing to change. In the end, the legacy of Reynolds and Hayes transcended their individual narratives. Their story became a mirror reflecting society's flaws and aspirations, a reminder that no one is infallible, but everyone has the potential to improve. It underscored the importance of holding people accountable without closing doors to redemption, balancing justice with compassion, and fostering dialogue between divided communities. Years later, as Hayes prepared to retire from public service, he reflected on the journey that had defined his career. Sitting in his office surrounded by awards and mementos, he smiled faintly. "This wasn't about me," he murmured to himself. "It was about planting seeds, seeds of change, seeds of hope. Now it's up to others to nurture them." Across town, Reynolds sat on a park bench watching children play under the afternoon sun. He thought about how far he'd come, from the brash detective who believed rules were made to be broken to the humble man striving daily to make amends. Life hadn't given him absolution, but it had offered something equally precious: purpose. And so as the sun set over the city skyline, casting golden hues over streets once fraught with tension, the echoes of their intertwined destinies lingered, a testament to the enduring power of accountability, redemption, and the belief that even in the darkest moments light can prevail.